When her older brothers divided their parents' estate, they took the stocks, the savings, the art, and the life insurance payout, leaving their 19-year-old sister with nothing but a worthless, dilapidated property in a forgotten corner of the state. What they didn't know, what no one had known for over 60 years, was that the property included a machine shop, sealed shut in 1957 by a grandfather they never knew, containing a secret that would change everything. If you've ever felt left behind or counted out, I need you to hear this. Hit that subscribe button, because this isn't just my story. It's a story for anyone who has ever had to find their own inheritance. The air in Mr. Gable's office was the color of weak tea and smelled of dusty paper and quiet desperation. It was the third Tuesday in October, my 19th birthday, the day I officially aged out of state custody and into this chair, this desk, this final, pathetic meeting. Mr. Gable was a public defender who had been assigned to the scraps of my parents' probate case, a man whose shoulders seemed to be permanently slouched under the weight of other people's misfortunes. He slid a large manila envelope across the polished surface of his desk. The sound was like a sigh. "That's it, Alara," he said, his voice gentle, which was somehow worse than pity. "That's what's left." I didn't need to open it. I knew what was inside. A deed. A piece of paper that said I was the proud owner of 3.5 acres of weeds and memories in a town called Harmony Creek. A town I hadn't seen since I was 6 years old, the day they came and took me away after the accident. My brothers, Mark and David, half-brothers from my father's first marriage, had been efficient. They were men in their 40s, with wives and mortgages and a cold, hard sense of what was theirs. They had descended on our parents' life like vultures, liquidating everything of value before the dust had even settled. They had their lawyers argue that since I was a ward of the state, my needs were met, and that the Harmony Creek property, with its crumbling house and massive tax lien, was more of a liability than an asset. A burden, they called it. A perfect burden for the girl who had always been one. I stared at the envelope. My hands felt cold and heavy, resting in my lap like stones. "They didn't leave anything else?" I asked. The question was a formality. I had been asking it for a year. The answer was always the same. "The accounts were cleared, Mr. Gable said, adjusting his glasses. "The house in the city was sold to cover their debts. This was all that was left in your father's name alone, willed to him by your grandfather. Your brother's counsel argued successfully that since they had no claim to it, it should fall to you. It satisfied the court's requirement that you not be left completely disinherited." He said the word disinherited like it was a legal term, stripped of all its jagged, personal meaning. But for me, it was the only word that mattered. I was an island, and the tide had just gone out for good. I finally reached for the envelope. My fingers trembled slightly. Inside, along with the brittle, folded deed, was a small plastic bag. It contained a single key. It was heavy, made of old, dark iron, with an ornate, almost floral head and a simple, cylindrical shaft. It was covered in a fine layer of rust that came off on my fingertips like reddish dust. "What's this for?" I asked, holding it up. Mr. Gable squinted. "I'm not sure. It was in the safe deposit box with the deed. The box hadn't been opened since 1988, the year your father inherited the property from your grandfather. He never went back there, you know. After your grandmother died, he couldn't bear it." I knew. My mother had told me once that the house in Harmony Creek was a place of ghosts for him. I just never understood what she meant until now. I felt the ghosts myself, right there in that stale office, 1,000 miles from the place itself. The ghost of a family I barely remembered, the ghost of a life I might have had. "There's the matter of the back taxes, Alara," Mr. Gable continued, his tone shifting from sympathetic to pragmatic. He was a lawyer, after all. "They're significant. The town could seize the property within the next 90 days if they aren't paid. A developer, A company called Northridge Holdings has already placed an offer on it with the county, contingent on the tax foreclosure. So there it was, the final turn of the screw. I wasn't just being given a ruin, I was being given a ruin with a deadline, a countdown to zero. I closed my hand around the rusty key, the metal biting into my palm. My brothers hadn't just left me with nothing. They had left me with a ticking clock, a final parting gift of failure. I could just walk away, let the county take it, let the developers bulldoze the ghosts and build something shiny and new. That's what anyone would do. It was the sensible thing. But as I sat there, with the weight of that key in my hand, another thought, quiet and stubborn, began to form. They had taken everything, every photograph, every piece of furniture, every dollar. They had stripped my history bare and sold it for parts. But they hadn't taken this key, this forgotten place. They had overlooked it. They had dismissed it as worthless. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt something other than numbness. It was a tiny spark in the cold, dark void. It was anger, and it was enough. I stood up, the legs of the chair scraping against the floor. "Thank you, Mr. Gable," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. He looked up, surprised by my sudden resolve. "What will you do?" he asked. I looked down at the key in my palm. The rust felt like dried blood. "I'm going to go see it," I said. "I'm going to go home." Mr. Gable's face was a roadmap of professional concern. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on a stack of files that seemed to be a permanent fixture of his desk. "Ilara, I need to be very clear with you. The property is assessed at nearly worthless. The house is likely uninhabitable. The back taxes amount to over $7,000. Northridge Holdings is offering the county $10,000 for the land. After the taxes are paid from that, you'd be left with maybe $2,000. It's not much, but it's more than you have now. It's a bus ticket somewhere new, a security deposit on a small apartment, a start." His words were practical, logical. They were the words of a man who dealt in outcomes, not emotions. He was offering me a clean break, a small sum of money in exchange for the last tangible link to my past. For a moment, I considered it. $2,000 felt like a fortune. It was survival. But the image of my brothers, their smug satisfaction, their calculated cruelty, flashed in my mind. They had decided what my history was worth. They had written me off. Accepting that money felt like agreeing with their assessment. It felt like letting them win. "Why does a developer want a worthless piece of land so badly?" I asked, the question forming slowly. It was the first strategic thought I'd had in a year. Mr. Gable shrugged his weary shoulders. "It's adjacent to a state forest. They've been lobbying the legislature to open up some of that land for a resort development, ski slopes, a lodge. Your 3.5 acres would give them primary road access. It's not about the land itself, it's about the location." It was a chess move. My worthless scrap of land was the key to their multi-million-dollar project, and they were trying to get it for pocket change. The anger I'd felt earlier solidified into something harder, colder. Resolve. "They think I'm just some kid who will roll over and take the first offer," I said, more to myself than to him. "They think I don't know what I'm doing." "To be fair, Ilara," Mr. Gable said, his voice laced with a gentle reality check, "you don't. You're 19, you have less than $100 to your name, and you're up against a corporation. I'm just advising you to take the path of least resistance. It's a guaranteed outcome." I looked him in the eye. I think it was the first time I had truly met his gaze without flinching. I saw a tired man who had seen too many people lose. He wanted to protect me from the same fate. But what he didn't understand was that I had already lost everything. There was nothing left to lose. "What if I don't want the path of least resistance?" I said. "What if I want to see what's behind the door this key opens?" He sighed, a long, slow exhalation of air. He picked up a pen and began to doodle on a legal pad, a series of interlocking squares. "The house was reported cleared out by your brother's agent. The locks were changed. That key is probably for an old shed, a garden gate, Something no one has bothered with in 50 years. An old shed, maybe, but the key felt important. It was too heavy, too ornate for a simple garden shed. It felt like a secret. My father had kept it with the deed in a bank vault for decades. He never used it, never went back, but he never threw it away. Why? I slid the deed and the key back into the manila envelope and clutched it to my chest. It felt like a shield. "There's a bus to Harmony Creek at 7 tomorrow morning," I said. "I'm going to be on it." Mr. Gable stopped doodling. He put the pen down and looked at me, his expression unreadable. He saw something in my face, I think. Not the vacant, traumatized girl who had sat in his office for months, but someone else. Someone new. He nodded slowly. "All right, Alara. All right. Call me when you get there. Let me know what you find. And be careful. Derelict properties can be dangerous." He was giving me permission, or maybe he was just stepping out of the way. Either way, it was the first time an adult had trusted my judgment, however flawed, in a very long time. I walked out of his office and into the gray afternoon. The city noise felt distant, muffled. My entire world had shrunk down to the weight of the envelope in my arms and the hard outline of the key I could feel through the paper. I had a destination. It wasn't much. It was a ruin with a deadline. But for the first time since my life had shattered, it was mine. The bus ride was 12 hours of rattling windows and the smell of diesel fumes and stale coffee. I had a window seat, and I watched the world transform. The dense, vertical geometry of the city gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to flat, endless farmland, and finally, to the rolling hills and darkening forests of the state's northern interior. With every mile, I felt like I was traveling not just through space, but through time. I was moving backward, toward a past I barely knew, a place that existed more in faded photographs and half-remembered sensations than in actual memory. I remembered the smell of pine needles after rain, the sound of crickets at night, the specific way the sunlight slanted through the big bay window in the living room. Small, insignificant details that had somehow survived the wreckage of the years. I had $74 in my pocket, a backpack with 2 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, and the manila envelope. It was the entirety of my worldly possessions. The other passengers were a quiet collection of the transient and the weary. A young mother with a sleeping baby, an old man in a worn-out baseball cap, a soldier in uniform staring blankly out the window. We were all running from something, or to something. Or maybe, like me, we were doing both at the same time. I dozed off somewhere in the dark heart of the state and woke up as the bus hissed to a stop. The driver called out, "Harmony Creek." My heart hammered against my ribs. I was the only one who got off. The bus pulled away, its red taillights disappearing around a bend, leaving me in a profound and sudden silence. The bus stop was just a wooden bench and a rusty sign on the side of a 2-lane road. Across the street, the town of Harmony Creek looked like a photograph that had been left out in the sun. The storefronts were faded, with peeling paint and dusty windows. Half of them were boarded up. A single traffic light blinked yellow, yellow, yellow into the empty intersection. It was just after dawn, and a low mist clung to the ground, muffling the world in a blanket of gray. It was even smaller, even sadder than I remembered. I pulled out the deed. The property address was 1420 Hollow Road. I asked the only other person I saw, a man unlocking the door to a small diner, for directions. He pointed a thumb down a side road. "About a mile that way. The old Miller place. Ain't nobody lived out there in years." The old Miller place. My father's name. My name. The walk was cold. The air was sharp and clean, filled with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The road was paved for the first quarter-mile, then turned to gravel. The houses grew farther apart, replaced by dense thickets of trees. Finally, I saw it. a rusted mailbox leaning sideways, the name Miller barely visible beneath a layer of grime and lichen. A gravel driveway, almost completely overgrown, disappeared into the trees. I took a deep breath and turned, pushing my way through tangled branches that scraped at my jacket. And then the trees opened up, and I saw the house. Mr. Gable had said it was uninhabitable. That was an understatement. It was a skeleton. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken back. The windows were gaping, empty sockets, most of the glass long gone. The porch had collapsed on one side, its wood rotten and gray. It looked like it was being slowly, deliberately swallowed by the forest. This wasn't a home. It was a grave. I stood there for a long time, the manila envelope clutched in my hand, a cold knot of despair tightening in my stomach. This was it. This was my inheritance, a pile of rotting wood and broken dreams. The developer could have it. They could bulldoze it to the ground. For a moment, I was ready to turn around, walk back to that lonely bus stop, and just leave. But then my eyes caught something. To the left of the house, set back about 50 yards, was another building. It was a long, low structure made of cinder blocks, with a sloped metal roof that was streaked with rust but appeared intact. It had no windows, just a single, wide, garage-style door on the front, and a smaller, regular-sized metal door on the side. The main house was decaying, surrendering to nature. But this building was different. It was solid, defiant. It was a machine shop, and on the smaller side door, glinting in the weak morning light, was a heavy iron hasp with a very old, very rusty padlock. A padlock that looked like it was waiting for a very specific, ornate key. I walked toward it, my boots crunching on the gravel and fallen leaves. The main house felt like a place of death, but this building felt dormant, sleeping. The closer I got, the more details I saw. The large garage door wasn't just closed, it had been welded shut. A thick, crude bead of metal ran all the way around its frame, sealing it to the wall. It was a deliberate, permanent act. This wasn't just a locked building. It was a vault. I reached the side door and pulled the old iron key from my pocket. My hand was shaking again, but this time it wasn't from cold or fear. It was anticipation. I slid the key into the padlock. It was stiff, grinding with 60 years of rust and neglect. I had to wiggle it back and forth, putting my whole body into it. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it wouldn't turn. It was the wrong key. It was all for nothing. Then, with a loud, grating crack that echoed in the silent woods, the mechanism gave way. The lock clicked open. I pulled the shackle free and let the heavy padlock fall to the ground. It landed with a soft thud in the damp leaves. The door itself had a simple knob. I turned it. It was unlocked. I pulled, and the metal door scraped open a few inches, releasing a puff of air that smelled ancient. It was the smell of cold concrete, oil, and something else. Something metallic and still. I squeezed through the opening and into the darkness. The air inside was thick and cold, colder than the morning outside. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy, and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut a bright, narrow cone through the absolute black, and I saw it. The world had stopped in here. Dust lay over everything like a fine gray snow, inches thick in some places. But beneath the dust, everything was in its place. A massive metal lathe stood in the center of the room, a silent, hulking beast. A drill press, a bandsaw, and a heavy-duty grinder were lined up against one wall. The other wall was covered, floor to ceiling, with tools. Wrenches, calipers, gauges, and files, each hanging on its own peg, their outlines visible under the thick blanket of dust. Blueprints were rolled up and stacked in cubbies. Metal shavings lay in a pile under the lathe, as if the person working had just stepped away for a moment. A calendar hung on the wall, its pages curled and yellowed. The flashlight beam landed on the date, July 1957. My grandfather, Arthur Miller, had sealed this place and walked away, and no one had been inside since. A wave of dizziness washed over me. This wasn't a shed. This was a laboratory. A sanctuary. I took a step forward, my boot print a dark scar in the gray dust. I ran my hand along the surface of a workbench, leaving a clean streak on the cold steel. Why? Why seal it like this? Why weld the main door and leave this one with its simple lock? It was a test, a puzzle. You had to have the key. You had to know there was another way in. I swept the flashlight beam across the room again, slower this time. My eyes were adjusting to the gloom, and I could see more details. There was a small office area partitioned off in one corner, with a simple wooden desk and a chair. On the desk, standing out from the uniform layer of dust, was a single object, a gray metal box. A lunchbox, maybe, or a toolbox. It had been placed dead center. It was the only thing that seemed deliberately staged. I walked over to it, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. It was a standard issue, military-style footlocker, but smaller. It wasn't locked. I brushed the dust from its lid, my fingers leaving clean trails. With a deep breath, I lifted the two latches. They snapped open with a sharp, metallic sound that was shockingly loud in the tomb-like silence. I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed cheesecloth, was a stack of envelopes tied with a faded ribbon and a single, leather-bound journal. On top of the journal was a small, folded piece of paper. My name, Elara, was written on it in a strong, slanted script I didn't recognize. But it wasn't my name. Not exactly. It said, "For Elara." Not to me, for me, as if the person writing it knew I would come, but was speaking to someone else. I unfolded the paper. It was a short note, the ink faded but still perfectly legible. It read, "To my son, Robert, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. Do not open this shop. Do not let anyone in here. The world is not ready for what is inside, and I cannot protect it anymore. Keep the key safe. One day, someone in our family will need not just a home, but a purpose. Someone with a clear eye and a steady hand. Someone who understands that the hardest path is often the only one worth taking. When that person comes, give them the key. The rest is up to them. Protect this place. It is the only real inheritance I have to give. Your father, Arthur Miller, 1957. I had to read it 3 times. My father's name was Robert. This was a letter from my grandfather to my father. He had obeyed. He had kept the shop sealed. He had kept the key safe. He hadn't passed it to my brothers, the men who saw inheritance as a dollar amount. He had left it, with the deed, where it would legally, eventually, fall to me. He had trusted that I would be the one with a clear eye and a steady hand. I sank down onto the dusty floor, the note trembling in my hand. Tears I didn't know I had been holding back began to stream down my face. I wasn't crying for my parents or for my own loneliness. I was crying for this man I had never met, this grandfather who, 60 years ago, had looked into the future and seen me. He hadn't left me a ruin. He had left me a test, a legacy, and a choice. The cold concrete seeped through my jeans, but I didn't care. The silence of the shop wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the weight of his words, with the presence of his trust. For 60 years, this room had been waiting. For me. What I found next would not just change my life. It would force me to confront the real story of my family and the difference between what something is worth and what it truly costs. If you've ever felt completely overwhelmed, like the weight of the past is too much to bear, I want you to take a second with me. Just breathe. Sometimes the moment before you stand up is the most important one. If this story is hitting you, let me know in the comments. Your stories matter here, and I read every single one. You're part of this community, and none of us are in it alone. Now, let's get back to that dusty machine shop in 1957. I sat there on the cold floor for what felt like an hour, the flashlight beam creating a small, warm circle of light in the vast darkness. The tears eventually stopped, leaving my face stiff and cold. The initial shock gave way to a profound sense of responsibility. This wasn't a game. This wasn't about getting back at my brothers anymore. This was something bigger. Arthur Miller had entrusted me with his life's work without ever knowing my name. He had trusted his son, and his son, in his own silent way, had trusted me. I finally picked up the journal. The leather was dry and cracked, but the book was heavy, solid. I opened it to the first page. The same strong, slanted handwriting filled the page, dated January 1st, 1957. The year begins with a chill, it started. Not just in the air, a chill in my heart. Henderson is getting greedy. He talks more of patents and profits than of people. He sees our work not as a way to build, but as a way to own. I spent the next few hours right there, cross-legged on the floor, reading my grandfather's journal. The story that unfolded was one of hope, brilliance, and eventual betrayal. Arthur Miller and a man named Frank Henderson had started a small engineering company after the war. My grandfather was the inventor, the visionary. Henderson was the businessman, the one who secured the funding and handled the contracts. Their primary project was something my grandfather called the kinetic core. From his technical descriptions, which were far beyond my understanding, it seemed to be a new type of engine or generator, one that was incredibly efficient, small, and powerful, capable of running on minimal fuel for an unprecedented amount of time. He wrote about it with a passion that was almost poetic. He wasn't just building a machine, he was trying to solve a problem. He envisioned his engine powering farms in remote areas, clinics in developing nations, homes that were off the grid. He saw it as a tool for independence, not control. But Henderson saw it differently. As they got closer to a working prototype, Henderson began making deals behind my grandfather's back. He was in talks with a major industrial conglomerate, a company that wanted to buy the technology, patent it, and then bury it. It would have competed with their existing, profitable business lines. They didn't want to use it. They wanted to eliminate it as a threat. The journal entries from the spring and summer of 1957 grew more and more frantic. My grandfather discovered the deception. There were arguments, threats. Henderson tried to force him to sign over the patents. He had powerful lawyers, and my grandfather, a brilliant machinist with a high school education, was outmaneuvered. The final entry was dated July 28, 1957. Henderson is moving to seize the workshop, the prototype, everything. He has a court order based on lies. I have one night. I cannot let him have it. I cannot let him destroy this work, or worse, use it for his own avarice. I will not let my legacy be one of greed. So I will hide it. I will seal it in time. I will weld the door and trust in the future. I will trust in my blood. Robert is only a boy, but he has a good heart. I will leave him a key and a prayer. This is all I can do. I closed the journal. The name of the industrial conglomerate Henderson was dealing with was Northridge Industries, the parent company of Northridge Holdings, the developers who were trying to seize my land. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a 60-year-old vendetta. They hadn't forgotten. They had been waiting, patiently, for the Miller line to die out, for the property to fall into neglect, so they could finally get their hands on what was inside this shop. My brothers, in their greed, had been their unwitting pawns. I stood up, my legs stiff. I swept the flashlight beam around the room again. This place wasn't just a workshop. It was a fortress. It was an evidence locker. He said he had hidden the prototype. He wouldn't have just left it sitting out. I started to search, my movements now filled with a feverish purpose. I looked under the lathe, behind the drill press. I opened drawers filled with schematics and technical manuals. The dust was thick, undisturbed. Nothing seemed out of place. I went back to the desk, thinking, I will hide it. He was a machinist, a builder. He thought in terms of structure, of hidden compartments, of elegant solutions. Where would a man like that hide his life's work? I ran my hands along the underside of the heavy steel workbench. Nothing. I tapped the concrete floor, listening for a hollow sound. Nothing. I was getting frustrated. The answer was here, right in front of me, but I couldn't see it. I sat down in the dusty desk chair, the old wood creaking in protest. I stared at the wall of tools, each one in its place. Perfect, orderly, and untouched for 60 years. And then I saw it. It was so simple, so obvious, I couldn't believe I had missed it. On the wall, among the dozens of wrenches and drivers, was a large, heavy-duty socket wrench. But unlike the other tools, which hung from simple pegs, this one was mounted on a square steel plate bolted to the cinder block wall. And the bolt heads, they weren't hexagonal. They were smooth, round, with no way for a wrench to grip them. It was a facade. I got up and went to the wall. I grabbed the socket wrench. It didn't move. It was welded to the plate. It wasn't a tool. It was a handle. I looked closer at the steel plate. Around its edge, almost invisible under the dust, was a hairline crack. It was a panel. I put my feet against the wall and pulled on the wrench handle with all my might. Nothing. It was sealed tight. I felt a surge of despair. Had I come all this way just to be defeated by a locked panel? Then I remembered my grandfather's words. A clear eye and a steady hand. I wasn't supposed to use brute force. I was supposed to think. I looked around the shop. What was I missing? My eyes landed on the drill press. It was a big, floor-standing model, with a large hand crank on the side for raising and lowering the spindle. The crank was a heavy, cast-iron wheel with a distinctive, four-spoked design. I looked back at the wall panel. In the center of the socket wrench handle, there was a small, square indentation, exactly the size of the axle on the drill press crank. My breath caught in my throat. It was a keyhole. I ran to the drill press. The hand crank wheel was attached with a simple pin. I fumbled with it, my fingers numb with cold and excitement, and pulled the pin free. The heavy wheel slid off its axle. I carried it over to the wall. It was heavy, at least 30 pounds. I lifted it, my arms straining, and fitted the square axle on the back of the wheel into the matching indentation on the panel. It clicked into place, perfectly. It was a key. I grabbed the spokes of the wheel and turned. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan of metal on metal, I felt something inside the wall begin to move. It was like turning the wheel on a bank vault. I turned it one full rotation, then another. With a loud clank, the bolts securing the panel retracted. The panel popped open an inch. I pulled the crank wheel free and set it on the floor. With trembling hands, I pulled the steel panel open. It swung outward on a hidden hinge, revealing a dark, square cavity in the cinder block wall. I shone my phone's light inside. The space was lined with lead. And inside, nestled in a custom-made cradle of wood and felt, was the kinetic core. It was beautiful. It was a sphere of polished brass and copper, about the size of a basketball, covered in intricate wiring and finely machined fittings. It wasn't just a machine, it was a work of art. Even in the dim light, it seemed to hum with a latent energy. This was it, the reason for everything, the secret my grandfather had died to protect, the inheritance my father had silently guarded, and now it was mine. I reached in and touched its cool metal surface. A lifetime of questions had just been answered, but 1,000 new ones had taken their place. What was I going to do with it? My grandfather's journal had laid out the moral stakes. Henderson's company, Northridge, had wanted to bury it. My grandfather had wanted to give it to the world, and in a sealed envelope at the bottom of the compartment, I found the final piece of the puzzle. It was a letter addressed not to my father, but to me, or rather, to the keeper of the core. "If you are reading this," it began, "then you have solved my puzzle. You have a clear eye. Now you must prove you have a steady hand. Inside this envelope you will find two things: the final, perfected schematics for the core, and the original, signed partnership agreement between myself and Frank Henderson, an agreement he later broke, but which was never legally dissolved. Northridge Industries, or whatever they call themselves now, do not own this technology, At best, they have a 50% claim, and my half is now yours. You have a choice. You can use their own greed against them. They will pay you a fortune for these plans and this prototype just to make them disappear. You could be wealthy beyond your dreams. You could walk away from this dusty town and never look back. Or you can do the harder thing. You can finish my work. You can build it. You can use it as it was intended to give power to the powerless. The world of 1957 was not ready. Perhaps your world is. The choice is yours. Make me proud. I sank to my knees, the letter in one hand, the cold weight of the schematics in the other. He was offering me an easy fortune or a difficult purpose. Sell out to the very people who destroyed him, or take up his fight. My brothers would have taken the money in a heartbeat. They wouldn't have even seen it as a choice, but I wasn't them. I looked at the kinetic core, gleaming in the darkness. It wasn't just a machine, it was a promise. It was a legacy of defiance. I knew what I had to do. The first phone call was to Mr. Gable. I called him from the front porch of the collapsing house, the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the trees. The connection was weak. "Elara, is that you? Where are you? Are you all right?" His voice was a mixture of relief and anxiety. "I'm at the property, Mr. Gable," I said, my own voice sounding distant to my ears. "I'm fine, but you're not going to believe what I found." I explained everything: the sealed shop, the journal, the letters, the kinetic core, the connection to Northridge Holdings. For a long time, there was only silence on the other end of the line. I thought I'd lost the call. "Mr. Gable?" "I'm here," he said, his voice hushed, stunned. "Elara, do you understand what you have? That partnership agreement, the schematics, this is dynamite." "I know," I said. "My grandfather left me a choice. Sell it to them or something else." "They'll try to crush you," he said, the pragmatic lawyer returning. "They have armies of lawyers. They'll claim the intellectual property lapsed, that the agreement is void. They will bury you in motions and fees until you have nothing left." "He knew that," I said, looking over at the solid, windowless wall of the machine shop. "He trusted me to be smarter than that." A new kind of silence stretched between us. It wasn't shock this time, it was thought. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, the tired, defeated public defender being replaced by something else, something I hadn't heard in his voice before. Excitement. "Okay," he said, his voice suddenly sharp, focused. "Okay, don't touch anything else. Don't talk to anyone. I'm going to make some calls. I know a guy, a patent lawyer in the city, an old friend. He owes me a favor. He's a shark, Elara, the kind of shark we need. Can you stay put?" "This is my home," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." 2 days later, a sleek black car crunched up the gravel driveway. Mr. Gable got out of the passenger side, looking out of place in his rumpled suit against the backdrop of decay. The man who got out of the driver's side was the opposite. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit, expensive shoes, and an expression of intense, predatory focus. This was Mr. Sterling, the shark. He didn't say hello. He just looked from the collapsing house to the solid machine shop and said, "Show me." I led them inside. I had left everything as I found it. The dust, the open panel, the core gleaming in its cavity. Sterling spent an hour in the shop, silent, touching nothing, just observing. He read the journal. He examined the partnership agreement with a small magnifying glass he produced from his breast pocket. He looked at the core with an appraiser's cold eye. Finally, he turned to me. "They don't know you have this," he said. It wasn't a question. "They just think they're buying a piece of land from a broke orphan to get road access." "That's right," I said. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. It was the baring of teeth. "Then they are in a great deal of trouble." The plan he laid out was simple, brutal, and brilliant. We weren't going to sue them. We weren't going to fight them in a patent court for 10 years. We were going to invite them for a conversation. A week later, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of a skyscraper in the city. The view was dizzying. Across the massive mahogany table sat two men in suits, their faces smooth and confident. They were lawyers for Northridge Holdings. Mr. Gable sat beside me, looking nervous but determined. Mr. Sterling sat at the head of the table, radiating an aura of absolute expensive calm. "Let's not waste time," Sterling began, sliding a single piece of paper across the table. "My client, Miss Miller, is the sole heir of Arthur Miller. She is not interested in your company's nuisance offer of $10,000 for her land." The first lawyer, the older one, chuckled. "Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, the property is facing a tax foreclosure. Our offer is more than generous. It's charity." Sterling's smile didn't waver. "And we are not interested in your charity. We are, however, interested in a partnership agreement signed in 1956 between Arthur Miller and Frank Henderson concerning the joint ownership of a technology known as the kinetic core, an agreement your parent company, Northridge Industries, has been violating for 60 years. The lawyers' smiles vanished. Their faces went slack with shock. The younger one stammered, I have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Sterling said, his voice like ice. He slid a second piece of paper across the table. It was a high-quality photograph of the core, sitting in its lead-lined cavity. "My client has the prototype. She has the schematics. She has her grandfather's journals detailing Mr. Henderson's corporate espionage and fraudulent dealings on behalf of Northridge. She has, in short, a story that would be very, very interesting to the press, and even more interesting to your competitors." The room was silent. The air crackled with tension. The lawyers were pale. They had walked in expecting to bully a teenager out of a piece of land. They had walked into an ambush 60 years in the making. "What do you want?" the older lawyer finally asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. This was my cue. I spoke for the first time, my voice quiet but clear in the silent room. "I want you to pay the back taxes on my property. All of it. As a down payment on the debt you owe my family. I want you to withdraw your offer with the county and formally drop any and all claims to the land. And I want a written guarantee that Northridge Holdings and any of its parent companies or subsidiaries will never, ever interfere with me or my property again." The lawyer stared at me, his mind reeling. "That's it? You're not asking for money? For a settlement?" I thought of my grandfather's letter, the easy fortune or the difficult purpose. "The money your company owes my family isn't something you can pay," I said. "Consider this an act of mercy. You get to walk away, and this story stays in this room. That's the deal." Sterling sat back, a look of profound, predatory satisfaction on his face. He had wanted to go for their throats, to sue them into oblivion. But he had agreed to my terms. He understood this wasn't about money for me. It was about justice, and it was about reclaiming my home. The lawyers didn't need to confer. They knew when they were beaten. "We agree," the older one said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I walked out of that building and into the sunlight, feeling taller than I had ever felt in my life. Mr. Gable clapped me on the shoulder, his eyes shining. "Your grandfather would be proud, Ilara," he said. "And your father, too." I didn't go back to the city. I took the next bus back to Harmony Creek. When I stepped off at the lonely bus stop, the air smelled different. It smelled like home. The work was slow and it was hard. The first thing I did was hire a local contractor, a gruff old man named Sal, to stabilize the house. He shook his head when he saw it, muttering about it being a teardown. But I insisted. "Just the structure," I told him. "The roof, the foundation, the porch. I'll do the rest." He looked at me, a skinny 19-year-old girl with $74 and a whole lot of nerve. And for some reason, he agreed. He even let me pay him in installments. The notice from the county arrived a week later. The tax lien was cleared. Northridge Holdings had withdrawn its offer. The land was mine, free and clear. With the house secured from further collapse, I turned my attention to the shop. Cleaning it was like an archaeological dig. I carefully removed the decades of dust, cataloging every tool, every blueprint, every stray nut and bolt. I bought books on machining, on basic engineering. I spent my days cleaning and my nights reading, the words of my grandfather's journal, my constant guide. The kinetic core remained in its hidden cavity. It was too important, too complex for me to tamper with yet. I wasn't ready. But I would be. My purpose wasn't to immediately change the world. It was to learn, to become the person my grandfather had trusted I would be. Sal would stop by after his work on the house, bringing me coffee and a thermos. He'd watch me struggle to clean a piece of machinery, and after a few minutes of silent judgment, he'd grunt, "You're holding it wrong," and show me the right way. He never said much, but his presence was a quiet anchor. He had known my grandfather, he told me one afternoon. Arthur was a good man, he said, looking around the shop. A dreamer. The town thought he was crazy when he sealed this place up. Said he'd lost his mind after his wife passed. But he knew what he was doing. He was always playing the long game. One evening, a few months after I'd arrived, I was working late, trying to restore the beautiful old metal lathe. I was covered in grease and grime, frustrated and tired. I heard a knock on the side door of the shop. It was Sal. He was holding a cardboard box. "Found this in the attic of the main house when we were fixing the roof joists," he said, setting it down. "Figured it belonged in here." I opened the box. It was filled with my father's things from when he was a boy. A baseball glove, a stack of comic books, a collection of model airplanes. And at the bottom, there was a framed photograph. It was a picture of my grandfather, Arthur, and my father as a young boy, standing right in front of the machine shop. My grandfather had his arm around my dad's shoulders. They were both smiling, and in the photo, my father was holding the old, ornate iron key. He was guarding it, even then. I sat down on a stool, the photo in my hands, and I finally understood. My father's silence, his refusal to ever return to this place, wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering. It was his way of honoring his father's last wish. He was protecting the secret, just as he'd been asked. He was protecting me. The inheritance wasn't the land, or the shop, or even the core. It was the story. It was the unbroken chain of trust that stretched across 60 years, from a grieving inventor to his loyal son, and finally to a lost girl who needed a purpose more than she needed money. I wasn't an orphan anymore. I was a daughter and a granddaughter. I had roots. They were just buried a little deeper than most. I put the photo on the workbench right next to my grandfather's journal. I looked from his face to my father's and then around at the shop, which was slowly, painstakingly coming back to life. This was my home, not because it was given to me, but because I had chosen it. Because I had fought for it. The work was just beginning, but I wasn't afraid. I had a clear eye, and my hands were finally steady. This journey taught me something I want to share with you. Sometimes, the things we inherit that have the most value are not the things we can sell. They are the stories, the responsibilities, the quiet promises kept across generations, the things that give us a reason to stand up and fight. My inheritance wasn't a pile of cash. It was a mission. And finding it, claiming it, has made all the difference. What about you? What have you inherited that isn't about money? It could be a skill from a grandparent, a sense of humor from a parent, a story that defines your family. I want you to share it in the comments below. Let's fill this space with the real legacies, the ones that truly matter. Your story is important, and this community is here to listen. If you believe in the power of second chances and stories like this, make sure you're subscribed. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being part of this. You're not alone.
Est-ce que... Pourquoi? Putain. Ok. Oh, aïe, 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 aïe. Bon, je suis désolée, je suis pas réveillée les copains, donc je fais un peu de la merde. Hein. Ouah, je viens de prendre cher. Attendez. Laisse-moi tranquille. Il est où? Juste reprendre un peu de vie, s'il te plaît. Je suis désolée pour le chat, je peux pas suivre en fait. Ah. Oh bordel de merde, il est horrible celui-là, vraiment. Hein. Je pense que toute seule, j'y arriverai jamais. Je vais mourir. Putain. Faut que je change, faut que je remette Julia. Ah voilà, ça m'a tendu. Voilà, ça m'a tendu. Ah merde.